Okay, so to look at these validation controls next, I'm going to make a couple quick changes here. I'm going to take out that HTML element altogether, so I better remove that reference to it here. Just going to delete it, and I'm going to go back to the toolbox and add another text box, an ASP text box instead. All right, so we'll just imagine that this is actually some sort of a data entry form, right? So this one, I'll give it a name, an ID, a better name, txt date. Okay, the idea is maybe I'll add a date in there eventually. But so this first one, oh, actually, I come think of it, I want to, oh, that's okay, I'll leave this, change the inner text of the heading, that's fine. Okay, so let's suppose first of all, our goal is to make sure that something is entered in this second text box, my txt ASP input, right? So I bring up the toolbox again. I'm going to pin it down to make it easier to work back and forth. Coming down to the validation controls, here are all the ones we just talked about in our PowerPoint. So the required field validator, if I just click my insertion point beside the text I want, I'll just double click to add the required field validator, right? Now, the next part I'm going to do, I'm going to definitely be wanting to come over to the properties window, right? Inside properties, okay, let me zoom to the back of the room. A few things in here. By default, it gives it an error message the same name as the validator itself. Now, validation controls are something that most of the time I don't bother ever naming them. Okay, there's exceptions where it might be important to name it, but usually these things just sit on the page and they do their job, right? So I don't ever have to refer to them in code or anything, so I won't bother naming it. But that's not a very good error message, is it, right? Please enter a value in the text box. It's always important to give good, friendly messages to your end users, right? So that they know exactly what they're supposed to do and, you know, things like that, right? So that's fine. I'll use that as the error message. We'll talk more about text in a minute. We'll see how the text and the error message kind of work in a team for different purposes. Now, right now, you notice here it looks black on the screen by default. I can change that here in 4-color. Actually, you know, there's a whole color wheel business up here if I really want to, but I'm just going to stick with standard color names, and that makes it easy for me. I'll just maybe make it red, right? Nice red font for the error message itself. Now, the most important single property for any of these validators is usually something like this: control to validate, right? Here's where having a proper ID on the other controls is important. I'll get a drop-down list of things I can validate. So, no, it's my ASP input. That's the one that I want to say, this is the one that is required. Has to be something in it, right? And that's all it will actually take. That's it, okay? There's some other properties I could set if I wanted to, but there's really nothing else essential. So let's actually run it again, and we'll just see the effect of that validator. Okay, so if I click the button now, oh, I love these error messages. They're so helpful. Yes, okay, I'm missing something. I should have mentioned that unobtrusive JavaScript, actually it was in the next slide in the PowerPoint, but it didn't go that far. Ever since an earlier version of the .NET framework and so on, you know, the whole world has gone to using this JavaScript, unobtrusive JavaScript library to help with client-side validation, right? And of course, this tool uses it as well. But in order to use it, you actually have to reference from a CDN or somewhere, or include it yourself, the unobtrusive JavaScript library. Well, we started with a empty project, remember, right? So I either have to add that in, a reference to that JavaScript, or there's another workaround. Okay, and fortunately, it's pretty easy to do the other workaround, and that is it will just actually use inline JavaScript. It will supply the JavaScript necessary when required. If we don't have it, try to default to the unobtrusive JavaScript. So that's easily fixed. I could either do what it says here or do what I'm going to tell you to do. So let me go back to Blackboard for a second. If you go to content categories, down near the bottom, look at that. Fix for error, unobtrusive JavaScript. So it's in a text file, so you can grab it there and copy paste. But basically, if we start with an empty website, what we have to do is add this to our web config file. Right? That's that configuration file we first looked at, that XML file. Now I found that I can actually even just copy and paste it right out of here. You don't really need the .txt file if you don't want to. I can copy it out of here and basically go back to my Visual Studio, come to my web config, and I usually put it right after the system web section, just paste it in here. So it's an app setting. The key is validation settings, unobtrusive validation mode, value none. So basically I'm saying don't look for or expect the JavaScript library for unobtrusive validation, right? And that's it. So now it will say, oh, okay, well, I'll do the hard work, roll up its sleeves, and I'll supply the JavaScript for you. I like tools that do the work for me. Have I said that before? Maybe once or twice already today. Okay, now let me run it again. Yes, question?
Where did you insert the
I put it in the web config file. I stuck it, it's its own section, so don't put it inside system.web or anything like that. But I always leave that one first, so I threw it in as the second section, app settings. Okay. All right, so now when I click the button, there we go. There's my error message showing up on the page, right? Simple as that, right? How much programming did I have to do? 0. I just stuck it on there, told it what control to validate, and it's doing the work for me. Now, you might have noticed that it didn't even post back, right? This is a submit button. It should post back to the same page, right? But it didn't even do it because this particular browser I'm using is supporting client-side JavaScript, so it generated the JavaScript for me, and it didn't even post back. Until I satisfy it by typing something in there, notice I can tab out, and again, I haven't posted back yet, but it cleared the message, all with client-side JavaScript that I didn't have to write, right? Now I could actually submit, and of course, because it's ASP, it is maintaining state and the value is still there in the text box, right? Okay, so that's an introduction to our first validation control. A couple other things about that maybe. You know, that's nice having that full message show up, but often what we do is they take up a lot of room, those messages. Maybe I just want a little star showing up instead. Well, that's where I said we might use the text property. So if I come over here, and in the text property for this required field validator 1, just, you know, shift 8 there, the little asterisk. That's what we commonly use on the page to show there's an error, right? Now I could run it now, but all you'll see is the fact that there's only a star showing up, which is okay, but it doesn't actually give us the full error message. So how do we, if we're going to take advantage of that so there's less room on the page used, how do we still show the full message to say what's wrong? Well, that's where that validation summary control can come into play. So maybe I'll just come down here right at the very bottom, going over the toolbox. I'll add a validation summary. I don't have to do much to it either. It automatically will go through and find everything. But a couple things I want to give it the same 4-color red, right? Just so that it matches. And header text, that's something I usually with a summary will provide, right? So this is the text at the top, and then I can have a list of different sorts. So we'll have a look in a moment, the different options for that. I'm showing all the errors on the page. But so for the header text, I'll say, please fix the following. Right. Notice the display mode, that's what I was referring to. So there's 3 choices. I can just see a list, a bulleted list, or in a single paragraph, I can just list them all. So it's your preference. I usually leave it with bulleted list as a default. Okay. So So now it's seeing the error messages listed in the summary, and I just get the star beside the actual text box, right? So that's useful. Now maybe you don't want this on the page as well. Well, let me come back to Visual Studio. By the way, this time I did Control F5 to run instead of just F5. So it's running, it's not in debug mode. But the advantage is I don't have to stop and start the web browser. I can come here, make changes, save it, and refresh the browser. So it's a little faster sometimes when you're developing. So Control F5 is a nice trick. I just most of the time forget to do it. Okay, so now I can come back here and I can make further changes without having to stop the browser. So what I'm going to do is in the properties of my validation summary, I'll point out there's a couple of booleans here. Show message box and show summary. So show summary by default is set to true, and show message box is set to false. I'm going to put them both true for a second. Save everything. If I come back to the browser, I can just refresh. So now you see I have a message box listing all the errors, but it's still showing the summary, right? Maybe I don't want a summary. I'm happy with the message box. So coming back, I'll set show summary to false. Save that and just refresh again. So now I just get the message box. Please fix the following, enter a value in the text box. You very nice client who's come to my site. Right, and away we go. Okay. All right, let me continue on in our PowerPoint for a little bit more. We're almost done it. So we've talked about our different validation controls. Okay, a bit of a tip here. We can attach more than one, okay, to the same input. So that allows us to combine, usually it's a required validator along with one of the others. It's the idea of both quantity and quality, right? It's maybe not enough to say you have to have something in, but maybe we also want to say not only something, but it has to maybe be in a range or be a date or, you know, whatever, right? Or match a regular expression, for example, okay? So by combining them, we get both types of validation available, right? Just a note there that validation controls always perform validation again on the server. So we can, in our server-side code, we can ask the page, it has a isValid property. It'll be true or false. So we can put that in our code and only execute certain code if the page is valid. That can be important because remember, not all browsers, if somebody's using a really old version of, like I said, Netscape 2.0 that doesn't know JavaScript from a hole in the wall, right? It won't be able to do client-side validation. So fortunately, it always does it again on the server, so we can make sure that we aren't counting on it being validated on the client by putting that if structure in our code, right? So it will try to perform validation using client-side script, which is what it's doing. If any validators are in error, the solution, the submission of the form is canceled if it's doing it on the client side. Otherwise, it will submit the form. If it has to use server-side validation only, it will submit it, and then it'll still generate and return the page with the same errors showing, but it'll all be generated by the server. And there we go. So it was actually .NET 4.5 and beyond tries to use unobtrusive JavaScript by default, so we have to add that little bit of code that we did to our web config file to get around that if we're using the empty website template. All right, enough theory. So let's get back to what we're going to do here. So let's add a bit more validation. So not only do I want something entered in here, let's say I also want it to be a range of numbers between 1 and 10, right? That'll be my next thing then. So coming back to the project, I'm going to get rid of the split screen here. I'm going to go right to the source for a second, or maybe right to design view. Okay, so I have my required field validator there. But let me also throw on a range validator. Coming to the properties, again, I will set, the red color. We'll see in a few minutes that we can use CSS for that instead, so we don't have to do it manually on each one. Value must be an integer between 1 and 10, right? For the text, I will again just put a star. Now again, the all-important control to validate is the exact same ASP input, TXT ASP input, right? You have multiple validators looking at the one. So most of the other validators won't even try to validate unless there's something there, right? So it's not a problem, the fact that they're both pointing to the same one. The required field validator will do its work first if it's blank, and then if there's anything in there, only then will the other validator try to validate, in this case, the range. Okay, now the range, though, I've got to come down here. There's 3 things to think about. Minimum and maximum value, 1 and 10, right? But very important along with that is type. Here's where a lot of the controls have this drop-down list, the data type, right? So I'm looking for integers, but you see you can do a range of strings, so alphabetically, yeah, between, you know, C, D, E, F, right, type of thing. Or you can do a range of doubles, of dates, of currency values, and so on. So I'm going to go with integer. Okay. So I'll just make sure I save everything, come back to Firefox and refresh. So now, okay, must enter a value in the box, but if I type garbage, okay, value must be an integer between 1 and 10, right? You might notice it's very subtle, but the first star was a little to the left, and then the next star is beside it. Not a big deal with stars because they don't take up much room, but if you were showing full error messages instead, right, this star would be way over to make room for the entire error message from the required field validator first, right? So that's one reason why I usually set, if there's going to be 2 together, whichever one is the closest, the left-hand one in this case, there's a property to set so it is dynamic, its display. So it doesn't take up any room if it has nothing to say, right? I'll show that quickly just by making that one change at a time. So if I come back to the required field validator, display right now is set to static, which means it always takes up room to show whatever it's going to show on the screen, whether it's showing it or not. But if I set it to dynamic, then it only asks for space on the screen if it has something to say or a message to show. It'll be a very subtle difference. It'll be hard to see. But if I zoom in first, then that first star is there. Click OK. Now it's the new message about the value, the range, but notice it looks like it's exactly the same place on the screen because the first one isn't trying to take up any screen real estate. Okay, that's just a little thing, but I like to share that as well. Okay, well that's good. So we have all our validation there. What about this text box? Let's play around with the compare validator, using it. It's the only one that we can use just for data type checking. I want to make sure I enter a date here and nothing else, right? I'm not going to say it's required. You can leave it blank, but if you put something, it has to be a valid date. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio. So beside that text box, I will put on a compare validator. Coming over to properties, a few things to set here. The error message. You must enter a valid date. Kind of sounds like you must enter it, but you don't have to enter it. It's optional, but if you do, it has to be a date. So I'll just say must be a valid date. How's that? Okay. I'm going to leave the error message showing there just for simplicity. Okay, so now this one's a little different. We still have our control to validate, right? So that was my txt date, ASP input control, text box. Now you can compare with this, you can compare values to another control. That would be good for like entering the same password in two text boxes. That's not what we want. You have an operator. So when we do the comparison, we can check for like greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, that type of thing. But also, we can just do the data type check, which is what I want. Type is date. That way you can do the data type check, make sure it's a valid date, right? And that's all I really have to do there. Now, you can optionally also say value to compare. So if you want to compare, not just do a data type check, but compare it to something, then you could enter a value in here. We're going to leave that alone for now. We're just going to do the data type check. Am I recording? Yes, I am. Couldn't remember. Okay, so let's go back, refresh the page. Huh. Oh well, I'll click the button. Oh, I better put in a value between 1 and 10. All right. Now it didn't complain because I didn't type anything in, right? It's not required. But if I type something in there, there we go. It must be a valid date. Notice the summary caught it as well as it's showing on the page. Okay. Must be a valid date. So if I put in a valid date, 2019, what is today? 07, 04. There, see, it went away immediately with the client-side script because now we've entered a valid date. So there's an example of just doing a data type check without it being required. And that's where the compare validator really shines. Now, just for fun, let's suppose, what if we want to make sure that they don't put a date in the past? It has to be today's date or a future date only. Well, we can easily do that as well. If I come back here, right? So instead of just doing a data type check, it will always do that, by the way. I will say greater than or equal to, but here's where that value to compare, sorry, I forgot to zoom, value to compare comes in. So I'll put in today's date, 2019, 07, 04, right? So right now it won't complain because there's it's empty. If I put 2019, oops, I cannot type today. 07, 03, okay. I should change the message so it explains that it can't be a date in the past, but you get the idea, right? So it's not happy. If I change it to today's date, now it's happy, right? Of course, you might say, well, that's good for today. What if they come to your application tomorrow, right? Obviously, that needs to be dynamic. But we're going to talk later on about how we would change that. It's easily done in code, right? Because, you know, we can actually change the attributes of any of these controls in code as well. Any questions? All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording at this point.